Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. This is the 6th week of the course and we will talk about emotions in this week. Now, it is almost impossible to imagine being alive without the sense of feeling some kind of emotion or the other. You might feel happiness, despair, sadness, disgust, shame, pride. There is an entire gamut of emotions that we feel on a momentary basis, sometimes for longer periods of time, but all the time there is a possibility of, if somebody asks you, you can describe your your state of mind, your state of life as a particular emotional expression. And as a species, we use emotions not only to communicate our wants or needs. Say for example, you can tell somebody that I am very happy, let us go out for a cup of coffee, or I am feeling very sad, I will stay inside the home, etc., etc. But we use these emotions not only to communicate our wants and our needs, but also to establish social relationships, to establish transactions, cooperations, and to form societies. Emotional understanding and expression of emotions is both a very important aspect of communication, and that is basically the basis on which human civil societies are formed. On an individual level, however, if we talk about it, we do feel the need to express our feelings and emotions. Moreover, understanding how others feel or how others are feeling at any given point in time is also a prerequisite. It is also very basic to be able to form relationships and to be able to form bonds. So, in that sense, you can see that emotions are a very integral part of our lives. They are a very integral part of our psychology, of our behavior, of also our social interactions as well. Now, it is interesting that till now or till very recently, let us say, emotions have actually not been considered as objects of science, or in other words as available for empirical analysis or measurement. However, researchers have realized eventually that conscious emotions may be arising from unconscious processes that can in fact be studied using the methodologies available to psychologists and neuroscientists. So, in a sense, there is an idea that you can measure or you can understand emotions using the tools that are available to psychologists and neuroscientists. Also, it has so far been realized that emotions are involved in several aspects of cognitive processing. For example, emotions can influence what we remember, they can orient or grab our attention, they can influence our decision making processes, and also bias our behavior and actions. So, a key question that can be asked and has repeatedly been asked is whether there is a dedicated neural system underlying the experience and expression of emotions, or they are just a form of, or they are just a general form of cognition that is just phenomenologically very different. What do I mean by phenomenologically very different is that the experience of emotions, or the way we feel any kind of emotions is fundamentally different from other kinds of mental or cognitive processes. So, this is a question we will partly try and answer in the course of this week, and in addition we might ask several of the other questions as well. Say for example, we can talk about what is a particular emotion, what do you mean by saying that I am feeling happy or I am sad, or say for example I am in love or I hate somebody, because each of these various emotions also correspond to significant and distinct physiological responses in the body. So, when I am saying that, let us say I am happy, am I talking about a particular kind of a physiological response pattern that my body is going through, or is it that I have thought that I am happy and I am describing a state of being or a state of my thought processes. So, there is ample debate about what and how to define an emotion. Secondly, are emotions basic for everyone? Are emotions available in the same manner, in the same kind for the entire species? That is also a question that we will talk about. We will talk about whether people across cultures, whether people across nations and other kinds of boundaries experience emotions in much the same way. Also, we will talk a little bit about how our emotions generated. What is the process that helps us generate these emotions? What is the process that helps us come up with these ideas of feeling happy or sad? Another thing that we will talk about is whether emotional processing with respect to the brain is localized to a specific area, or is it generalized and distributed across the entire area of the brain, or it might be both. So, we will talk about that as well. We will also talk about the fact whether how do emotions affect our cognitive processes like perception, attention, learning, memory, decision making, and then our overall behavior. Is it possible, or does this happen that emotions interact with the way we learn about our surroundings, the way we sample the data that is present there? Remember, in the last week we have talked about memory. So, do emotions affect our cognitive processes of attention, perception, learning? Do emotions affect the what portion of information about a particular episode we will remember, and what portions of that episode we will forget? Okay. So, finally, do our cognitive processes have any influence over our emotions? That is the other question, is just flipping the earlier question around and asking, does our memory impact how we are going to feel, or can our memory influence how we are going to feel about particular things, or let us say, can our attention make us feel happier or more sad in a given scenario? So, is there a two-way interaction, is there a one-way modulation, or what is this direction of this modulation, are all things that we are going to ponder about and discuss in the rest of this week. Now, let us begin with talking about the first question. What is an emotion? It has been found that defining emotions has not really been a very easy task, and several researchers have actually wondered about the lack of a proper definition for an emotion. People have say for example, written chapters in books where they have just wondered and talked about the fact that there is no appropriate definition of emotion that is available. Let us take an example. Suppose, how will you define an emotion? If you begin to define an emotion in a manner of a feeling, an argument can be made that a feeling is basically the experience of the emotion. It is mainly the subjective experience of a particular emotion. Say for example, you feel like this when you are happy, you feel like that when you are sad, you feel like this when you are angry. But is the feeling exactly equivalent to what the emotion itself is? This is a question that many people have grappled with. Oshner and Gross in 2005 have defined emotions in a sort of a slightly broad definition, and they have defined emotions as valenced responses to external stimuli and or internal or mental representation. So, the idea is that emotions are external, are valence responses to external stimuli. Valenced basically meaning either positive or negative, and this might vary over a continuum. Okay. So, they say that emotions involve changes across multiple response systems. There are different ways in which you can respond with emotions. Say for example, there is an experiential response. What are you feeling when you are confronted with a particular kind of a stimulus? Suppose, say for example, you are watching a favorite movie, or you are meeting a favorite person, or somehow you kind of come across somebody who has hurt you in the past, somebody who you have not been very comfortable with. That is an experiential response. There could be a behavioral response as well. Say for example, what do you decide to do then? Do you run away? Do you stay? Do you attack the person? Do you try and forget it and ignore the person? How does that really work out? Similarly, we can talk about physiological responses as well. Physiological response, say for example, if you suddenly encountered a snake in your garden, what is the response going to be? Are you going to really think and decide whether I should be afraid or not, or you will automatically experience a physiological response, basically the increase of the heart rate, the sweating of the palms, the shortness of breath, all of that. So, basically emotions involve changes across these various response systems in response to external stimuli. So, that is something that is very, very important. Now, emotions, Oshner and Gross actually distinguish emotions from moods, because moods basically are sort of semi permanent and slightly longish experiences of particular kinds of emotion, and in that sense they might or might not have a particular trigger. But emotions often have identifiable objects or triggers. For a mood, it is not very easy to determine why am I in a happy mood or why am I in a sad mood today, or why am I feeling very lethargic or dull today. But say for example, if suddenly you are feeling very happy, or suddenly if you are feeling very angry, it is usually in response to an identifiable object or an event that would act as a trigger. So, the idea is that you have to be able to identify what is causing this emotion at this moment in time. Okay. Now, emotions can also be either unlearned responses to stimuli with intrinsic affective properties. Say for example, when you touch something that is prickly or hot, you will immediately drag your hand backwards. Okay. So, emotions can also, say for example, in some sense be either unlearned responses to these kind of stimuli which have these intrinsic affective properties, or sometimes they can be learned responses to stimuli with acquired emotional value. Say for example, you will fear when you come across, let us say, a pet dog of somebody else that has bitten you in the past, or say for example a stray dog that has bitten you in the past, you will have say for example, even if the snake has not really bitten you ever, or if a spider has not really hurt you ever, but as soon as you come across a snake or a spider, you will automatically learn to fear that. So, that is basically one of the ideas. Now, emotions can involve multiple types of appraisal processes that assess the significance of the stimuli towards your current goals. So, the idea is that emotions can basically involve these kinds of appraisal processes wherein you are evaluating what does the stimulus mean for me. Okay. Say for example, if you are very hungry, a plate of any of your favorite food might seem very appealing, but say for example, if you are not feeling very hungry, then the plate with the same food might not seem very appealing to you. Similarly, people all the time are appraising the significance of an event. In say for example, if you if you are given a particular news that your friend X or Y is coming to town. Now, if you really were looking forward to meet that friend and is a good friend, you will be happy about it. Or suppose if it is coming at a not so good time where you are very busy with your work or something else, you might not feel as happy or as excited than in the other scenario. So, emotions continuously and they involve multiple types of these appraisal processes. Now, also one of the things that is peculiar about emotions is that they may depend upon different kinds of neural systems. So, for example, sadness and happiness may be governed by different neural circuits in the brain, and all of this basically is in that sense something that scientists have been working to figure out. Now, psychologists generally agree upon the fact that emotions consist of at least three kinds of components. First is a physiological reaction to a stimulus. If you are coming across a snake, if you step on a snake by mistake, or say for example confronted with a wild animal, or say for example even a dog that is infamous for biting people, there will be a degree of a physiological reaction. There will be, say for example, as I was saying, the racing of heartbeats, the sweating of palms, the shortness of breath, and so on. So, one of the major components of an emotion is the physiological response. The other component is a behavioral response. What do you do after that? Do you fight or do you flee away? So, the idea is that what are you going to do in response to the emotion triggering stimulus is a very important component of how you understand or define emotions. Finally, there is also this very important aspect of subjectively how you are feeling about a particular stimulus. Say for example, whether you are feeling very happy about it, whether you are feeling not so happy about it, whether you are feeling rather sad about it, what is it that is happening at the feeling level, not at the physiological level necessarily, but at the feeling level. How are you feeling? Okay, how can you describe your state of mind if if you want to elaborate upon this. So, there are three components of emotions. First is the physiological response to any given stimulus. The second is the behavioral response, basically what is it that you are going to do, and third is a feeling that you have, the subjective experience of the emotion. These three are very, very important component of emotions. Now, let us look at some of the neural systems for emotion processing. Now, several components of the nervous system have been basically implicated in the experience of emotions. Say for example, when emotions are triggered by an external event or stimulus, our sensory systems will play a very important role. Say for example, again let us go to the snake example or a biting dog example. As soon as you see the snake, let us say in your garden, the initial work is by the sensory systems, where they are analyzing and understanding the stimulus, that okay, there is this noise and this slithering movement in the grass, it must be a snake. So, the first window is basically the sensory analysis that you are actually carrying out. Okay. So, that is a very important part. Now, when emotions are triggered, let us say so there is a chance where the emotion is being triggered by these external events or these external stimuli, like a snake or a dog or a lion you come across. That's which is basically rare, but then the sensory system kind of is the window, or is let us say is the primary trigger to causing the particular emotion, because there is where the first analysis will come from. However, sometimes emotions can also be generated just by your own memories. There is nothing outside, but say for example, you are just sitting there idling and suddenly you come to think of something rather funny, or suddenly you come to think of something that is a very important experience from your childhood, a very happy experience from your childhood, and automatically there is a smile on your face and you feel slightly uplifted, slightly happier and in a good mood. So, emotions can sometimes be triggered by just an episodic memory, in which case the memory system, the detail of the memory, say for example, we have talked in the last chapter about the details of episodic memories, or say for example, if the memory is too old, then there are just the gists, but if you probe it enough, you might be able to remember some more aspects about that particular memory. So, then your memory systems will be involved. Now, the physiological components of emotions involve the autonomic nervous system. If you remember, we have talked about this in the first chapter itself. We talked about that there is a central nervous system and there is an autonomic nervous system. This autonomic nervous system basically has connections to all the organs of the body and the peripherals, and it basically is composed of two branches. What are the two branches? The first branch is the sympathetic nervous system, and the second branch is the parasympathetic nervous system. What do these do? These branches are basically connected and to the motor and the sensory neurons, which extend to the heart, the lungs, the gut, the bladder, the sexual organs, the genitalia, that is, and in that sense these organs are capable, these connections, through these connections the autonomic nervous system is able to modulate the activity of each of these organs through these connections. Now, these two systems, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, can work together to achieve homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is the balance of optimal survival conditions or optimal conditions for the body. So, these two systems basically work together, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems work together to achieve what is called homeostasis, wherein the sympathetic nervous system promotes the fight or flight response. It would basically say, for example, supply more oxygen, it will basically slower the digestion, it will dilate your pupils, it will prepare you for the fight or flight response, it will prepare you for some kind of action in response to a particular emotion triggering event. Whereas, the parasympathetic nervous system basically works to rest, works on the principle of rest and digest, whereas basically the system is focused on calming you down, it is focused on basically slowing the entire reactionary response of the body. It is focused on calming you down and in some ways sedating the body by control through these different organs that I talked about. So, it will lower the heart rate, normalize the blood pressure, it will basically supply give more time to the gut to start digesting and getting more energy and so on. So, the idea is that the physiological components of emotion are typically governed by the autonomic nervous system, which basically balances the the excitement or the sedation part by the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, the autonomic nervous system in itself is basically regulated by the hypothalamus. We have seen the photos of the hypothalamus, we have seen where it is basically part of the midbrain. Now, the hypothalamus also controls the release of the hormones from the pituitary gland, and basically the fight or flight system, obviously it relies on the motor system, because it will either prepare your body to be in readiness for a fight response or to be in readiness for a flight response, to run away from a particular place. Now, arousal is a very important component of emotions, and it is supposed to be regulated by what is called the reticular activating system, and this reticular activating system basically is composed of these sets of neurons that basically extend from the brainstem to the cortex via the rostral, intralaminar and thalamic nuclei. So, the arousal aspect of emotions, arousal is basically and we will talk about arousal going in the next lectures, but I will just give you a very brief idea that arousal is a very important component of emotions. More often than not, or let us say to just simply describe what arousal means, is basically means the intensity level of the emotion. So, for example, you might be feeling happy or sad or angry, but the intensity of physiological excitement is basically given by arousal. Now, let us talk about the limbic system. Now, the limbic system basically is the system that is responsible or is the system is the circuit neural circuit that is responsible for expression and experience of emotions. Now, James Pepys in 1937 had proposed that emotional responses involve a network of brain regions that are basically made up of the thalamus, the anterior thalamus, the cingulate gyrus and the hippocampus. So, he said that this is basically the circuit that is responsible for emotional processing, let us say. Paul MacLean in 1949-52 named these structures as being part of what is called the Pepys circuit. Now, further MacLean extended this emotional network to include the visceral brain, as he would call it, adding the Broca's limbic lobe and some of the subcortical nuclei and some portions of the basal ganglia. So, you see the network per se is expanding in a manner. Now, later MacLean also added the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex to the system, and together this entire neural circuit was referred to as the limbic system, and the name limbic system is still very popular and still used by several scientists to refer to the emotion processing network. Here is where you can see the limbic system, you can see the orbitofrontal cortex, hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, thalamus, cingulate gyrus, and you can see the corpus callosum, which is connecting the two hemispheres. Now, MacLean's early work for identifying the structures of the limbic system as responsible for emotional processing was very significant, and it is still it's still a very popular choice. The name limbic system is a very popular choice to describe the network of areas that perform the task of emotional processing within the brain. However, the limbic system, as was outlined by Pepys or MacLean, has not really found support in research over the years after their proposal. For instance, for example, it is now known that several brainstem nuclei that are connected to the hypothalamus are actually not the part of limbic system, they are not involved in emotional processing, as are several nuclei that are involved in the autonomic reactions. But now, say for example, they are known that they are not to be, they are known as not being part of this process of this circuit that processes emotions. Another difficulty in establishing the exact areas involved in emotional processing is that it has been impossible to establish the establish the criteria for defining which structures and which pathways should be included in the limbic system. So, it is not really very clear on the basis of what do you include a particular area as part of the emotional processing network. On the other hand, earlier proposed areas have actually been shown to be more important for some other kinds of cognitive processes other than emotional processing. We have done the chapter on memory in the last week, and I am sure you know by now that the hippocampus is a very important organ for memory processing. It is not really shown to be very relevant, or we will probably discuss in the coming lectures, not really shown to be predominantly important for emotional processing. In summary, MacLean's model of the limbic system has proven to be more like a descriptive concept rather than being instrumental one in furthering the understanding of the neural basis of emotion. Now, let us look at some of the emerging concepts about these emotional networks. So, we have talked a little bit about the limbic system. Let us look at what is known at the moment. Now, more recently, investigations into understanding emotional processing have been slightly more detailed and complex. Researchers have measured the brain responses to emotionally salient stimuli, and they've kind of found out a complex interconnected network in the analysis of emotional stimuli, or you can say emotional processing. Now, this network has been found to be include these areas: the thalamus, the somatosensory cortex, higher order sensory cortices, the amygdala, the insular cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex, including the OFC, the ventral striatum, and the anterior cingulate cortex. So, this is the network of areas that has been sort of found to be implicated in emotional processing, and these are the areas which are found to be part of what was earlier being referred to as the limbic system. Now, emotional processing is acknowledged as a multifaceted behavior that may vary on the continuum from being very simple to very complex, and hence it in that sense it has been very difficult to capture it within a very single definition or a single neural circuit. Research on emotions now uses specific types of emotional tasks, and then identifying and basically on the basis of them they try to identify the underlying specific emotional behaviors. Now, the idea is that depending upon specific tasks or situations, different neural networks in the brain may be recruited to kind of govern or influence our emotions, our experience of these emotions. A key question in that sense is whether different neural circuits underlie the different emotion categories, or if emotions emerge out of basic operations that are not specific to emotions. So, it can be that, say for example, dedicated neural circuits are designated to process specific aspects of emotions, or it could be possible that, say for example, different or say for example, emotion processing is just part of a slightly generic network of brain areas which are not exclusively dedicated to emotion. This is referred to as the psychological constructionist approach, or if say for example, psychological constructionist approach. It has also been proposed that it could be that just a combination exists where some brain systems are common to emotions allied with separable regions of the brain dedicated to processing individual emotions such as fear, anger, and disgust. So, the idea is that specific regions of the brain might collaborate with each other to participate in specific emotions such as fear, anger, or disgust. These are not supposed to be thought of as exclusive networks, but parts of these networks are shared and parts of these networks are slightly unique to these functions. Now, according to the constructionist approach, as I was just mentioning, the brain may not necessarily function with the specific emotional categories. Rather, the psychological function mediated by an individual brain region might be determined in part by the network of brain regions it is firing with. So, the idea is that it is not necessary that the brain is functioning according to specific emotional categories: happiness, sadness, anger, etc. Rather, it is possible that the psychological function that is mediated by an individual brain region is determined in part by the network of brain regions it is firing. So, basically it is probably a network of regions that are governing the processing of particular emotions. So, as per this view, each brain network might involve some brain regions that are more or less specialized for emotional processing, along with other regions that may be also part of different brain functions, different kinds of cognitive functions. Say for example, hippocampus might be participating in some degree of emotional processing, but it is dedicated for memory based processes or something. Okay. So, let us take another example. Say for example, the dorsomedial prefrontal areas that represent self and others are found to be active across all emotions, while brain regions that support attentional vigilance are recruited to detect threat signals the brain regions that represent the consequence that threat, the brain regions that represent the consequence that a stimulus will have for the body are activated just for discuss. So, the idea is that there can be these brain regions which activate or which are active across the entire set of emotions, but some regions are activated specifically for particular emotions as well. Now, just to sort of summarize this, just as the definitions of emotions are slightly dynamic and they are ever changing, so are the findings of these neural areas that are held responsible for emotional processing. So, I have just given you a circuit of areas that might be or that is according to current knowledge involved in emotional processing, but 5 years later, 2 years later, there might be more research that says okay, well, some of these areas are also involved in other activity, or more areas have to be put into this emotional processing network and so on. So, both of these things are sort of in a bit of a dynamic phase or in a bit of a flux kind of a situation. That is all for the first lecture. I will talk to you about emotions again in the next chapter.